I have presided over hundreds of cases. I've watched families collapse. I've watched business partners destroy each other. I've watched people lie with tears in their eyes and tell the truth with trembling hands. But there was one case, one ordinary civil hearing, that still follows me home, not because of the money, not because of the legal argument, but because of a homeless boy and a wallet worth $10,000. And believe me, when that boy walked into my courtroom, Apa thought I already knew exactly how the story would end. I was wrong, very wrong. The hearing was scheduled like any other civil property dispute. Small courtroom, routine paperwork, no cameras, no media, nothing dramatic. At least, that's what we thought. The plaintiff arrived first. His name was Robert Whitmore, mid-50s, successful businessman, tailored suit, expensive watch, controlled posture, the kind of man who enters a room expecting the room to adjust itself around him. Years on the bench teach you something. People with money don't always look arrogant, but people used to being obeyed. You noticed them immediately. Robert sat down, opened a leather folder, organized documents, prepared calm, too calm, interesting. Then the courtroom doors opened again. And everything changed. A court officer walked in beside a teenage boy, 17, maybe 18, then oversized hoodie, worn shoes, no luggage, no confidence, no eye contact. He carried a small plastic bag, that was all. His name was Noah Carter, homeless. At least according to the case file. And honestly, that surprised me because homeless teenagers usually don't end up in my courtroom over $10,000. The clerk began reading. 3 weeks earlier, Robert Whitmore reported losing his wallet. Inside, cash cards. Business documents, total estimated value, just over $10,000. 2 days later, the wallet was returned, completely untouched, returned by Noah. And somehow, that led both of them into my courtroom. Interesting, very interesting. Because honest returns rarely become legal disputes. Something didn't fit. I asked Robert directly. You got your wallet back? He nodded. Yes. I asked, money intact? Yes, interesting. Then I asked the obvious question. So why are we here? Robert looked toward the boy. Long pause, then quietly said, because I think he stole something anyway. Dead silence. The courtroom shifted instantly. Interesting statement, very dangerous statement, because people don't usually sue after getting everything back, unless they think they lost something else. I turned toward Noah. He didn't react. No anger, no interruption, nothing. Years on the bench teach you another lesson. People wrongly accused usually react. Confusion, frustration, shock. But this boy looked tired. That bothered me immediately. I asked Robert, what exactly do you think was taken? Robert folded his hands, then answered, my trust. Very interesting, because emotional language inside legal settings often means one of two things, manipulation or unresolved emotion. I asked him to explain. He stood, walked slowly, looked directly at me, and said, when someone returns $10,000, pause, there's always a reason. The audience shifted, I didn't. He continued, no homeless kid returns that kind of money. Now pay attention carefully because this sentence changed the room. Not because it was cruel, because it revealed assumption. And assumptions often tell me more than testimony, Robert continued. He wanted something. Interesting. I turned toward Noah, still silent, still looking down, still holding that plastic bag. I asked, did you return the wallet? He nodded. Yes, I asked. Why? Long silence. Too long. He looked uncomfortable, then quietly answered, it wasn't mine. Simple answer. Too simple. And honestly, simple answers often scare people because they don't leave room for negotiation. Robert laughed. Small laugh. Not mocking, dismissive, dangerous difference. Then he said something I still remember. No one says no to $10,000. The boy looked up for the first time and quietly said, I do. Dead silence, no anger, no performance, just I do. Interesting. Very interesting. Years on the bench taught me this. People performing honesty explain too much. Real honesty usually sounds inconvenient. I asked Noah, where did you find it? He answered, bus stop. I asked, how long did you keep it? He answered immediately, 20 minutes. Fast answer, natural answer, good sign. I asked, what did you do? He looked confused. Then I counted the ID cards. Interesting not to cash the ID. I asked, why? His answer made several people stop writing. He said, if I lost mine, pause, I'd want it back. Dead silence. I looked at him carefully, then noticed something, his sleeves, then weathered cold marks. And honestly, that's when I realized something uncomfortable. This boy wasn't pretending to struggle. He looked hungry. Robert interrupted, and his interruption bothered me. He said, ask him where he slept. Interesting, very interesting. I turned. What does that have to do with this? Robert answered. I looked at Noah's soft voice. Where do you sleep? Long silence. Then different places. Nobody moved, I asked. Last night? Pause. The boy looked embarrassed, then quietly answered, behind the grocery store. The courtroom changed because suddenly everyone realized this wasn't a poor kid returning money. This was a homeless teenager returning enough money to completely change his life. And honestly, that didn't make sense. I looked directly at him and asked the question that changed everything. You had $10,000 in your hands. Pause. And you still gave it back? He looked confused, then answered quietly, I thought that's what people are supposed to do. Dead silence. I looked toward Robert, and for the first time all morning, he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the boy. And honestly, that stare didn't look angry. It looked emotional. That's when I realized this case was not about a wallet, not even close. Then Robert slowly stood up, looked directly at Noah, and said, Tell the judge what you asked me after returning it. The boy froze instantly, and suddenly, I knew I was missing something. Robert stood slowly. No sudden movement, no courtroom drama, just slow, and that bothered me. Because people trying to win cases usually move with certainty. But this man, he looked like someone carrying something heavy. Years on the bench teach you something strange. Sometimes people don't bring cases to court to win. Sometimes they bring them because they don't know how else to speak. The courtroom stayed silent. I looked toward Noah. He froze. Immediately. Not nervous, not confused. Frozen, and honestly, that reaction told me more than words. People don't freeze because of questions. They freeze because of memories. Rob looked directly at the boy, then quietly repeated, Tell him. Long silence. Noah looked down. His fingers tightened around the plastic bag. Interesting. Very interesting. I leaned forward, soft voice. What did you ask him? Long silence. The boy swallowed, then quietly said, I asked if he had kids. Dead silence. Interesting, very interesting. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. The audience shifted. Robert nodded slowly, then quietly said, Tell him the rest. The boy looked uncomfortable. And honestly, that made me more interested because rehearsed stories become smoother. Real stories become harder. Noah looked at me, then quietly answered, I asked, pause, if they miss him. Dead silence. Nobody moved. Now that changed everything. Because suddenly, this stopped sounding like a wallet story and started sounding personal. Too personal. I looked toward Robert. His expression changed, not anger. Something else. Something heavier. I asked, What did you say? Robert laughed quietly. Tiny laugh, broken laugh. Then answered, I told him my daughter doesn't talk to me anymore. Interesting. Very interesting. That answer changed Noah immediately. He looked up. First time small reaction, big meaning. I asked, What happened next? Long silence. Robert looked toward the ceiling, thinking. Then quietly said, He handed me the wallet, pause, and said something I still can't explain. The courtroom stayed silent. I looked back at Noah. What did you say? Long silence. The boy looked embarrassed, then quietly answered, I said, pause. Maybe she just needs time. Nobody moved, dead silence. And honestly, that answer disturbed me because empathy from comfort feels normal. Empathy from suffering feels different. I looked carefully at Noah and asked, Why would you say that? He looked confused, then quietly answered, Because people leave when they hurt. Interesting, very interesting. Years on the bench teach you to notice sentences that sound older than the person saying them. That sentence did, I asked. Who left? Long silence. The boy looked down immediately. Big reaction, then quietly answered. Everyone. Dead silence. Nobody moved. Now the room changed, not emotionally, psychologically. Because suddenly, I realized this wasn't a boy describing one event. This sounded practiced, repeated, dangerous. I asked carefully, What do you mean? Long silence. Then, my mom. Pause. My stepdad. Pause. My aunt. Pause. And shelters. Nobody moved. The courtroom became very still. I asked, How long have you been alone? He shrugged. Interesting reaction. People who suffer for long periods often stop measuring time emotionally, then quietly answered. Almost a year. Dead silence. Robert looked away immediately. Interesting. Very interesting, I asked. You go to school? No answer, I asked again. Nothing, then quietly. No. The audience shifted. I looked at Robert, then asked, So why are we here? Long silence. Robert looked uncomfortable, then quietly answered, Because, pause. I wanted to understand. Bad answer, very bad answer. Not because it sounded false. Because people don't file lawsuits to understand. I looked directly at him, then asked, What aren't you telling me? Long silence. Very long silence. Then, Robert opened his folder, pulled out a photo, walked toward my bench, placed it down. I looked, and honestly, AP will never forget what I saw. It was a picture. Old faded, a little girl, around 10, smiling, standing beside Robert. Then I noticed something disturbing. The hoodie blue, same color, same style, same toy car in her hand, dead silence. I looked up, then looked at Noah. He was staring at the photo, frozen, actual freeze. And Robert quietly said, Judge, pause. Ask him why he knew exactly what toy she used to carry. And suddenly, I realized this case had never been about $10,000, not even close. I have spent years in courtrooms, long enough to know that coincidence is usually overrated. People call impossible things fate. Judges call them evidence. But as I looked at that photograph, AP didn't think of fate. I thought of something else. A mistake, because mistakes reveal truth faster than pressure. The courtroom stayed silent. Nobody moved. Robert stood beside my bench. Noah stared at the photograph. And honestly, I wasn't looking at either of them. I was watching Noah's eyes. Years on the bench teach you something important. Recognition happens before explanation. You see it. Tiny changes. Breathing focus, mirror. And Noah looked like someone who recognized something he shouldn't. I asked quietly, "Have you seen this picture before?" Long silence. The boy swallowed. Then no. Interesting, very interesting. Wrong answer. Not because I knew he was lying, because he answered too quickly. Fast denial rarely means deception. Sometimes it means fear. I picked up the photo, looked carefully. Little girl, blue hoodie, toy car happy. Noah looked uncomfortable. Then I noticed something else. The photo edges were worn, folded, opened repeatedly. Robert carried this often. Interesting, very interesting. I looked up and asked, "Who is she?" Long silence. Robert answered quietly, "My daughter." Pause. "She left 5 years ago." Dead silence. Nobody moved. Interesting, because now the room had changed again. No longer rich man versus homeless boy. Now father versus absence. I asked, "What happened?" Robert looked at the photograph. Long silence, and then quietly answered, "She stopped speaking to me." Weak answer. Very weak. Years on the bench taught me something. When people describe emotional disasters in one sentence, they're hiding 20. I asked, "Why?" Long silence. He smiled. Broken smile, then quietly said, "I was busy." Bad answer, very bad answer. Not because it sounded false, because it sounded incomplete. People lose jobs, people lose houses, people lose relationships. Nobody loses a child to being busy. There's always something underneath. I turned toward Noah's soft voice. "What does this have to do with you?" Long silence. The boy looked embarrassed, then quietly answered, "Nothing. Interesting, very interesting. Same mistake. Too fast." I leaned forward and quietly asked, "Then why are you scared?" Dead silence. That question changed him immediately, because suddenly his eyes filled. Tiny change. Huge meaning. Years on the bench teach you another thing. Fear and sadness are cousins. But guilt looks different. This wasn't guilt. This looked personal. Robert looked at Noah, then quietly said, "Tell him what you asked me." Long silence. Noah stared at the floor, then quietly said, "I asked," pause, "if she still keeps your messages." Nobody moved. Dead silence. I looked directly at him. Interesting. Very interesting. That's not a normal question. Not from a stranger, not from a teenager, I asked. "Why would you ask that?" No answer. I waited, because silence works. Eventually, he quietly said, "Because people save things." Interesting, I asked. "What people?" Long silence, then people who leave. Dead silence. Now I was uncomfortable, not emotionally, professionally, because something invisible was happening, and I still didn't understand it. I turned back, asked Robert, "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Long silence. Then he answered, "I wanted him somewhere safe." The courtroom froze. "Interesting, very interesting," I asked. "What does that mean?" Robert swallowed, looked toward Noah, then quietly said, "When he returned my wallet," pause. I followed him. Dead silence. Nobody moved, and honestly, that sentence changed everything. I leaned forward, cold, observing. "You followed him?" Nodded. Long silence. Then I watched where he slept. Nobody moved. I asked, "For how long?" Long pause. Then quietly, 3 days. The audience shifted instantly. Dangerous territory, very dangerous. I asked carefully, "Why?" Long silence. Robert looked embarrassed, then quietly answered, "Because," pause. He reminded me of someone. I looked at the photo, looked at Noah, looked back, then asked, "Who?" Robert stared directly at Noah and quietly said, "My daughter." Dead silence. Nobody moved, not even Noah. And honestly, that answer should not have made sense. But the way Noah reacted, that terrified me, because instead of confusion, instead of surprise, instead of asking questions, boy quietly looked down and whispered, "I know." Dead silence, pure silence. I stopped writing, looked directly at him, and quietly asked, "How do you know?" Noah slowly reached into his plastic bag, pulled out something folded, old, careful, protected, and placed it on the evidence table. I unfolded it and immediately understood this was never a wallet story. It was a story about a letter. I remember exactly how the paper felt, been folded too many times. Edges worn, not treated like garbage, treated like something important. Years in court teach you to notice objects. People protect things that protect them. And this letter, whatever it was, had been protected. The courtroom stayed silent. Nobody moved. I unfolded it carefully, not because I thought it was evidence, because suddenly it felt personal. The paper contained handwriting, blue ink, short, still old, at the top. "Dad." Dead silence. Interesting. Very interesting. I looked up immediately. Robert had gone pale, actual color leaving his face. His breathing changed, tiny reaction. Huge meaning. Years on the bench teach you this. People can fake emotions. But recognition arrives too fast. I looked back down and continued reading. "Dad, I know you're busy. You don't have to keep saying sorry. I know work matters. But if you ever have time, still keep the toy car. Love, Emily." Dead silence. Nobody moved. I looked at Robert. His eyes never left the paper. Interesting. Very interesting. Then I looked at Noah. He wasn't looking at me. He was watching Robert. Not nervous, not guilty, watching, like someone waiting. I asked quietly, "Where did you get this?" Long silence. Noah swallowed, then quietly answered, "Bus station." Interesting. Very interesting. I asked. When? Pause then. 8 months ago. The courtroom changed instantly because suddenly the timeline mattered. Robert looked up, fast, huge reaction. I turned. When did your daughter leave? Long silence. Then. 8 months ago. Nobody moved. Now this bothered me. Not emotionally, logically, because impossible coincidences make judges uncomfortable. I asked Noah, tell me everything. Long silence. Then the boy quietly started speaking, and honestly, the entire courtroom disappeared for a minute. He said, it was raining. Pause. I was sleeping inside the station. Pause. There was a trash can. Pause. I found the letter. Interesting, I asked. Why did you keep it? Long silence. Then, because nobody wrote me things. Dead silence, nobody moved. And honestly, that answer hit the room harder than anything else, because suddenly, this wasn't a homeless kid collecting trash. This was a boy collecting proof that someone once cared about someone. I stayed quiet, he continued. I read it, pause. Then I folded it, pause, and kept it. I asked, why? Long silence. Then because pause. If somebody wrote that once, pause. Maybe somebody still misses somebody. Dead silence. Robert closed his eyes immediately. Interesting, very interesting. I turned toward him and quietly asked, when did your daughter disappear? Long silence then. She turned 18. Pause. She packed. Pause. She left. I asked, why? Long silence, very long silence. Then she said, pause. I only cared when things were broken. Dead silence. Nobody moved. Interesting. I looked down, looked at Noah, then asked, why did you ask him if she keeps messages? Long silence. Noah looked embarrassed, then quietly answered, because, pause. I thought if she kept writing, pause, maybe she wanted him back. Nobody moved. I looked toward Robert. And honestly, for the first time all day, he looked smaller. Years on the bench teach you something painful. Success protects people from consequences. Until suddenly, it doesn't. Robert looked directly at me, then quietly said, when he gave me the wallet, pause. He gave me the letter too. Dead silence. Very interesting. I asked, you returned the letter? Long silence. Then, yes. I asked, why? Noah looked confused, then quietly said, it wasn't mine. Dead silence. Still answer. Agan. And honestly, that's when something clicked. I looked directly at Robert and quietly asked, if this was never about the wallet, pause. Why did you bring him to court? Long silence, very long silence. Robert looked at Noah, then quietly answered, because I found something. Dead silence. He slowly reached into his folder, pulled out photographs, several, placed them on the evidence table. I looked and immediately understood. This case was about to become something else entirely. Every photograph showed Noah, different places, different days sleeping. Eating, walking, and in almost every photo, someone had left food nearby. Nobody had noticed except Robert. Then he quietly said, I think somebody's been following him. And suddenly, Noah's face changed, not fear, recognition.